Hello, everyone. Shane Lynn at MacArthur Museum of Arkansas Military History, and back with you, and have a very special guest. I have Marci Bynum Robertson. She's the Executive Director of the Literary Action of Central Arkansas. She has an extensive experience in the museum field. She was a curator and historian and grant writer for the Museum of Discovery. She's also has been the Associate Director of Foundation Relations at the Arkansas Arts Center. But today she's going to talk to us about some research that she's done on a very interesting lady, a teacher in Arkansas at a time when it wasn't, it's not a particularly good period in history for the United States, I would say, during World War II. We're going to talk about Americans who were interned in camp. And a lot of times they say they're Japanese, but they were actually Americans. Many of them, they were of Japanese ancestry. So I think it's important to identify them first as Americans, because that's what they were. They weren't just Japanese. And of course, with World War II and Pearl Harbor, there was some prejudice and fear that went into Japanese people of ancestry, many of them Americans, around 120,000 total, were put into 10 camps around the United States. When I say put in camps, they were called internment camps. They were really prison camps. They were had barbed wire around them. They had guard towers with soldiers who guarded them with machine guns, and they couldn't leave. And this was where Japanese Americans lived. And in fact, two of those camps we're going to talk about, those were in Jerome and Rohwer, and up to about 8,500 people of Japanese ancestry lived in each of those camps for 3 to 4 years during the war. But since they were placed in these camps, they still needed things like schools and places to live. And some of them had their own newspaper. And one such teacher we're going to talk about actually taught here in Arkansas. And Marci, thanks for being here. And why don't you just tell the folks a little bit about Mabel Rose Jamison, known as Jamie Vogel.
Well, you want to start out with Miss Vogel, or
Sure.
Should I do my little speech first?
Well, do your little speech first. That'd be great.
Well, people always ask, well, what prompted this interest? Well, as a native Arkansan who was always interested in history, I was pretty appalled, actually, that I never heard about these relocation camps until I took Japanese history when I was in college. So I thought, how did I make it through 19 years, born, raised in Arkansas school system, and not know about this? And so that got me interested in it. And then when I started in the public history program at UA Little Rock, they said, okay, what's your thesis topic? You know, they pretty much try to get that to you on day one, Dr. Carl Moneyhan. And so I started thinking back, and I was like, this, because I'm not a revisionist historian, I consider myself an inclusionist historian, because I want to use public history to tell the stories of people whose voices have not been heard. Right. So that's why we like to talk about women's history, African American history, Japanese American history, because as you pointed out, these were people of Japanese American ancestry, but it was only the Issei, who were the first generation, who were not truly Americans. So, Mrs. Vogel was a very interesting woman, and I was lucky enough to get to interview her about 1.5 years before she passed away, because she was living in a retirement community in Memphis. And so she had lived in some different places after she taught at the camps, and she came back to Memphis, and she was pretty excited. She said, I used to get a lot of calls to talk about this, but I think the calls had kind of slowed down. And so she was very excited to talk to me that day about her experiences in the camps.
Awesome. Well, I'm really glad that you decided to do this research, because it's a story that needs to be told, especially today. I think when we have an uprise in violence against Asian Americans, and we need to remember all of the history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this was certainly a bad and ugly time in American history, but we need to remember it and tell that story. So let's talk about Miss Vogel. How did she get involved in teaching at the camp?
She was actually teaching in Hot Springs at the time, and the federal government contacted her to kind of assess her interest in teaching in the camps. And she was only in the first semester of her teaching contract. And so her principal and superintendent were not very happy, but she, you know, what do you do when the feds say, we want this teacher? And so traditionally, because the feds felt like they might alienate some of the state education folks, they tried to limit to only 2 teachers per school district that would be recruited for the 2 different camps, Rohwer and Jerome. But the camp still did not have enough teachers. And so they had to use evacuee teachers, as they called them. And there were in some cases, there were twice as many evacuee teachers as there were Caucasian teachers, like Miss Vogel.
And so she gets the call, which actually the federal government paid more to the teachers in the state of Arkansas, which
a lot more,
which lured some of the teachers to the camps, and much to the anger and of the local officials in the state.
Well, at this point, we get to introduce Senator Hattie Caraway, who's one of our favorites.
Right.
You know, because there were local community members who got upset because they felt like conditions were better in camps and they didn't have to adhere to the wartime rationing, which was not true at all. I mean, I found records of teachers helping to issue shoe ration coupons, you know, so
right.
but the state teachers, I've got, let's see, Mrs. Hattie Caraway talked to the head of the War Relocation Authority, and she said, well, what's going on here? Why do these teachers make so much more money? And the head of the WRA said, for one thing, the conditions are adverse, and that was his terminology. And also, these teachers were on a 12-month contract as opposed to the traditional 9 or 10-month contract. But a typical teacher in a 4-year, their 12-month contract, they earned $1,620 a year as a civil service employee, and a Caucasian teacher comparable in Arkansas earned $533.
Wow.
So that's $1,620 to $5,333, which is a huge difference. And you've got to think, in wartime America, that makes, you know, that could, emotions were running high with these camps in these rural areas anyway. And there was so much racial misunderstanding behind that and antipathy. So yeah, it was.
Did she face any personal backlash from friends or family or other coworkers or anything by going and teaching?
She didn't really talk about that. Like I said, her principal and superintendent were not happy, but her family, I was impressed with how supportive her family was, because they, you know, with rationing going on, it was very difficult for her to get all the supplies that she needed for her students and for other folks, because other folks in the camp came to her for help in addition to just the students. Her family would send her these big, like, care packages and crates of things. And I was amazed because she kept pulling out all this artwork, and it might be done on a piece of denim or some other type of fabric, which there's actually a long Japanese American tradition with painted fabrics. But she had all of these things, and she had one of the first desks in the camp. And it was something her family sent her a lot of stuff in a big packing crate, and that was a desk.
Right, and I may not have pointed this out at the beginning, but she was an art teacher. She taught art.
Yes.
And so she would need a little bit more extra supplies than just the regular pencil and paper and things of that. So she needed art supplies. And did she find her experience rewarding?
Oh, definitely. I mean, this is how many decades after the fact, she would get tears in her eyes talking about the students and how she loved them. And she really felt like it was her job to help these kids acclimate, because, whenever, I've developed a couple of different education programs, and the thing, as a museum person, you try to make the interpretation relevant to the viewer. And so first person interpretation, I'll tell a student, okay, you are going to be moved from your house. You can pack one suitcase. You don't know where you're going. You don't know how long you'll be there. You don't know what the weather's like. You don't know what they'll have on that end. What are you going to do with your bike, your pet, your house? What about your baseball glove? Do you think you're going to need that? Is that worthy taking up room in your suitcase? And so Ms. Vogel, because these kids, there was such upheaval in the Japanese American community, and within that discrete structure of the Japanese American family, these kids needed that stability. And the parents also, education is so highly prized in that community. The parents were ready for the kids to be in school. And so Ms. Vogel knew that that would be a stabilizing influence, not only on the kids to help them adapt, but also on the family unit.
Definitely. And I'm sure, do you know how many students she might have on a given day?
She didn't really talk about that. Rohwer had, or between Rohwer and Jerome, I think that they had either 3,000 or 4,000 students between those two. And there were a lot more secondary students than primary students.
Right.
Just because of how long the people had been in the United States and, the birth cycles.
Exactly. And so did she have any contact with any of her students after they left the camps?
Oh yeah, she had a stack of correspondence with these former students, and before the camps ever closed, the students, college-age students, were allowed to leave if the college would accept them, basically. And so I think Hendricks in Arkansas was one of the only colleges that would accept students. And it tended to be smaller, more liberal, religious-based schools. So yay, Methodists. But she helped a lot of those students to get into college and gave them career advice. And Henry Sugimoto was one that you probably heard of, that she really fostered a little more. Even, she had some of his artwork, and I was amazed because, on the one hand, my later curator self was kind of horrified because she had me pull the couch out from the wall, and there were canvases propped up behind the couch against the wall. And so,
right.
These were works from her former students, and some of the works were things that they had done while in the camps, and some of them were things that that sent her later.
Right. And so after the camps start closing in 44 and 45, and her services are no longer needed teaching in the camps, what happens to her?
Well, she was single when she started teaching, but on her way home from Little Rock, she would go home to Little Rock sometimes, and then she was on her way back to camp. She met her future husband, Mr. Vogel. And so he was a camp guard at I believe it was the Italian POW camp, not far from there. And so they met and got married in 1945. And then as the camps were closing down, everything was wrapping up, they moved. She had a stepson, I believe, that lived in New York. And so they lived there for a while, and then they settled in Ohio and lived there. Her husband died fairly early, though. And we didn't really get into how she came back to Memphis,
right,
to this area. But she went back, and I think she did some art commissions, and then she taught as well.
And but she, you mentioned some of the students had given her and sent her part of their artwork, but she donated that to museums and gave to later on in life. Correct?
She did. She gave some things to the Smithsonian, and I was lucky enough to go when I was doing research at the National Archives for my thesis in the War Relocation Authority records. There was also an exhibit at the Smithsonian about relocation. And it was really interesting because they had talk about your first person immersion experience. They had a relocated camp block. So like the actual living quarters, what they would have been like in the camps. And so she donated some materials to the Smithsonian. And then, like I said, she sent a lot to one of the later mayors of the town who grew up with the camps. And I think her father had been in there. So Rosalie Santine Gould, I think was her name. So it's the Gould Vogel collection, basically. And it's part of the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies here at the Bobby Roberts Library at Cowles.
Right.
So you can see those. They have those on display. They'd have different parts of the collection that rotate on and off periodically.
And then I believe I read where she may have donated some items to Manzanar, the National Park Service museum dedicated to.
In California?
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
I think I saw some of that as well. So
I think she gave some to the Japanese American National History Museum,
right,
in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I wouldn't be surprised if they have a long-term loan policy with Manzanar to trade out some of those.
Right. So, well, it's great to see that she preserved a lot of this work, and I would imagine for those students who a lot of them were very young, probably didn't know what was going on. One day they're in California, and the next day they're on a train, a 3-hour ride from they're used to the city to really the countryside of Arkansas. I'm sure it was very foreign to them. And then to be able to maybe express themselves through art, and that's something that hopefully that they were used to, and she helped them with that.
It really had to have been culture shock, because I know that most of I hope that the kids who and the folks that see this know about George Takei, because he was relocated from Los Angeles to Rohwer. And so he has talked about, and I've met him and heard him speak a few times about, it was a swamp and like the size of the mosquitoes. And he came from Los Angeles, and Los Angeles in the 1940s is very different from rural Arkansas.
Definitely.
So, and there's always been speculation. I think you and I talked about why Arkansas, when everything else was like the West Coast, and yes, you did have Hart Mountain and some of those that were more remote, but Arkansas's 2 camps are definitely the outliers.
Well, it's probably also what Governor Homer Atkins was saying. Why here? He wasn't a fan of having them in Arkansas.
Well, the Farm Security Administration had what they considered a big plot of useless land.
Right.
But they had that, and they felt like sticking them in here. And Arkansas didn't have the political power to resist something like that.
No, they didn't. And it's interesting you mentioned George Takei. He wasn't ever a student of Mrs. Vogel, was he?
Not to my knowledge.
Right. Okay. So what do you feel her legacy is, Miss Vogel's legacy?
Well, she really was a woman ahead of her time. And I think that she fostered the creativity in a lot of these students. And if they'd found a less sympathetic teacher, it would have been a lot harder on them, because, democracy was a big part of the curriculum. The curriculum was established by a Stanford University summer school program, basically. And the more experienced teachers took that just kind of as a suggestion, as opposed to the straight curriculum frameworks. And so I feel like Miss Vogel was able to put her own personal stamp on these things to kind of mitigate, because these camps were based on the Bureau of Indian Affairs tribal schools, the reservation schools. And we know how those schools tried to indoctrinate Native populations. And the fact that these students were behind barbed wire and being taught about patriotism and how great the U.S. government is while they're being simultaneously imprisoned. And they might have a father or a brother or a cousin who's off fighting in the 442nd, which is one of the most decorated military units in history, the Japanese American relocation community. And so she was able to normalize the experience for many of these kids instead of tamping down that creative impulse. And she said that she felt like her Japanese American students had a greater aesthetic appreciation than most of the white students that she had taught in the past.
And thank you for bringing up the 442nd, because we're going to be putting up an exhibit in September, our Undaunted Courage exhibit, and it talks about the relocation camps here in Rohwer and Jerome, but also the unit, the 442nd, which was the enlisted men were made up of all Japanese Americans. Of course, many of the as soon as Pearl Harbor was bombed, you know, they were Americans. Their allegiance was to America, and they wanted to fight the soldiers who were of age. And as they were cleared, and the United States needed manpower to fight that war, they realized, well, we won't let them go, obviously, and fight against Japanese, but they were allowed to go fight against the Italians and Germans in Italy. And as you said, highly decorated unit, and has a great story. And so in September, we're going to be telling that story with our Undaunted Courage exhibit.
Well, and if anybody has the opportunity to see Allegiance, which is the George Takei musical, it's a great historical document, because a lot of the things that came up are things that I've heard from personal experience from different folks of the camps. Right.
And as you said, George Takei, who was here in Arkansas as a child, you know, one of the camps, he has worked extensively with Arkansas Department of Heritage, and I had a chance to meet him several years ago when he was here working with the different museums to tell the story. And he's obviously very passionate, and you know, I appreciate him and others who I'm sure was such a traumatic event that, you know, many of them couldn't talk about it, but it's important for the ones who can and tell us what it was like, so it can be passed down in history, so it's not forgotten. I think.
And we have a couple of local folks whose families did come back after relocation, even though you and I talked about Governor Atkins. You know, he passed legislation so that it was illegal for those folks to come back and buy land here.
Yeah.
But we had a couple of families that did come back. There were a couple of families in North Little Rock, and then there's a couple of folks that are still around that you can talk to. In fact, one was born in the camps.
Right. Local. And it's we're fortunate to still have those folks around to, as you say, there's this revisionist history going around, whether it be what's happening with that about the Holocaust or Japanese internment camps. You know, some of those folks believe it never happened, or it happened a different way than was actually the truth. And I think it's important that we make sure the truth is known. So that's one of the reasons Mrs. Vogel's recollections and story is told and preserved. So thank you also for being interested in doing that. And I know a lot of people have done also a lot of research and have written about the camps and the tragedy, you know, what happened with Japanese Americans.
In my interview, you can hear that oral history interview with Mrs. Vogel at the Butler Center, because I donated it to them several years ago.
So yeah, hopefully folks who are interested in this will go to the Butler Center and hear that interview. Now, I've never heard it, but now I'm so excited to know that it exists. I do want to see it now. So the Butler Center will probably be seeing me very soon.
There's so many different aspects to relocation that we don't really think about. As the child of a psychiatric social worker, I was real interested in the sociological aspects too, and the long-lasting impacts on the family unit, because it really did tear apart that essential fabric of the Japanese tradition. You know, with the father as the head of household, and the camp experience just tore apart all of that societal fabric. And
the ancestry and traditions of Japanese culture is to follow what the government tells you, and you to be a good citizen. So there was no objections when they were told, we're taking your land, we're going to put you in these internment camps. They did that because that was their traditional history to follow.
And the
government.
Japanese have a phrase, and if I pronounce this correctly, it's shikata ganai, which means basically what will be. And, it's almost like que sera, sera. But the fact that they have a phrase for that, that you're supposed to follow the rules. You go to college, you listen to your teachers.
Right. And many of the Americans of Japanese ancestry, like you said, they lost their homes, their cars, their property, and many of them never got any of that back after the war.
Right, because we know that home ownership is one of the greatest wealth generators from generation to the next generation. And so they lost that. If they could find a Caucasian person they would trust to take care of things while they were gone, that was fine. But what if that person turned out to be not trustworthy?
Right.
Or what if they had to sell out for pennies on the dollar? You could never recoup that type of loss.
Right. And you did hear about there were a few good Samaritans who did do that, who kept the land for them, but not many. And that's sad. Now there were was it the 1970s that some reparations were paid to some of the Japanese families, but certainly not in what they had lost in terms of their original.
And Ms. Vogel worked towards some of that legislation. I'm not sure what her exact involvement was, but she was very supportive of that. And I'm sure she sent a lot of letters and contacted congressmen probably in support of that. Because she felt like these students were just like any other students, although more advanced artistically, a lot of them.
Right. So. Well, thank you so much for being part of this interview. Thank you for keeping her story alive and for next generations of people who need to hear it.
Oh, you're welcome.
And I hope to see you at the museum very soon.
I hope so.
Have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.